knowing that our place is in university. And ultimately, that brings with it certain constraints, because ultimately we're subsidised by the university, so they pay for us to exist, which means that budgets are not limitless. We are competing against all sorts of other priorities, and you might know that the landscape of higher education in the UK has changed enormously over the last 2 years, especially in the last year, which has put huge pressures on university budgets, for example. And being as we are at a university that is not an arts institution in a sense, so that it has very strong kind of social sciences, human rights tradition as well, it means that we have to navigate that as best we can if we want to continue to be supported by the institution. But I think it gives us enormous opportunities too, because it actually makes us reflect on our size and our scale and what's possible. And what's possible if you are a small-scale, nimble institution with limited budgets, it actually makes you quite creative. So historically, we've been able to do a lot with not very much. And I think not having that huge thing to service, the huge budgets, the huge committees and all those kind of things, means that we can take a risk. And I think maybe what will happen is that we'll go back to being the sort of risk takers on a small scale, which actually in the past has ended up kind of feeding into institutions like Tate. So for example, we did exhibitions first with Jorge Macchi from Argentina. We did exhibitions first with Leon Ferrari. So artists who were at that moment not very well known, either because they were early in their career or just had not been rediscovered. But then because we were able to work with them in our university context, other institutions picked us up. I think I'll stop talking.
That was great. I'm going to ask one more sort of general theoretical question for other two speakers, and then we'll open to the audience for questions. But I wonder whether you feel there is a difference from your personal points of view in your institutions, or perhaps more generally, between militancy and positive discrimination. I don't think they're the same thing, but I wonder what you think about that.
Well, I liked the definition that was offered up earlier of militancy as strongly espousing a cause. And espousing a cause and having actual percentages, quotas, are very different. And so, yes, I'd say they're very different. We strongly advocate, just ask the question, can we come to the V&A and see your women sculptors? They only then think about it, sort by sex, and realize they have 3 on show. And then, sure enough, the next year we see in their guide to patrons a tour of women sculptors at the V&A. So by asking the questions, you can create some change, but that is very different than militancy or quotas. I'm not saying that I wouldn't necessarily like to see some quotas on boards of institutions and things like that, but they are very different.
Yeah, thank you. Jill, do you want to?
Well, I would just add that I think you can have positive militancy. Can we argue that that's a thing whereby I think, for example, the New Hall Art Collection would not describe any of the works as particularly militant in terms of the way Joanne defined the term as aggressive, or, I mean, some of them do deal with wider debates about women in warfare and women in social and political issues. But in terms of the many of the pieces in the collection, they're not necessarily advocating a militant reaction to any kind of issue. But the collection as a whole forms a reaction to discrimination more widely in the arts, and also perhaps in academia, and therefore in a positive way, the collection kind of fights for women's rights and equal presence. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I mean, it's still not uncontroversial having a specific dedicated collection or book or exhibition, whatever, dedicated to women. So I think there are still issues that are important and we need to talk about. I mean, my own area, apart from Latin America, is surrealism, and there was a very large, famous exhibition organised by Bill Rubin in Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1968, in which there were just two women. Really very surprising. More recently, a book's been published of the work of 300 women associated with surrealism. So that so there is the need to actually look specifically in a particular area, but there's the ghetto problem. So could I now ask if there are either if you want to ask questions of each other on the panel, or if there are questions from the audience on any of these areas. No. Jane, thank you. Jane England, who has done more than most gallerists to bring certain very neglected women to the forefront of the art world. So, yeah.
I'm a product of the late 60s and 70s, and I did go to the same university as Germaine Greer, and she was older than me, but I do remember her coming and giving us talks. So I guess I come from that tradition from Australia. So I'm instinctively supportive in that way. And also I'm intellectually curious about what other women were doing. But one of the things I was going to bring up was actually apropos the collection of Escala, because I feel that this collection has developed, but I feel that you don't always have the opportunities to display it in the way that it deserves. And of course I made a rather subversive suggestion that perhaps, as there's a wonderful building in Colchester, First Sight, which is by a Latin American architect, that perhaps rather than being given a small corner, the Arts Council might have a rethink about possibly incorporating and liaising more with the university and giving Escala occasionally, giving you the whole space to allow you to do occasional full exhibitions. And so that's my little bit of subversion, that I think that's a campaign that could be started. Because I think an exhibition of the holdings of Escala at least once a year, given the entire space, is something that should be thought about, so that people are more aware of the collection and more aware of the work you're doing, and about the sort of significance of the university and the department, because I think from what I remember being told that a lot of Latin American academics and intellectuals clustered around the university at the time of when things were difficult in Latin America, and I think that should be marked in the art world as well. And it just seems a missed opportunity, because I know that you don't get the chance to show things in the scale that you'd ideally like. So there you are, my suggestion.
Thank you for that, Jane. I mean, in response, I would say, well, it's not within my control to decide what happens to that building. And I would also say that actually there is something about the small scale that is also helpful and useful, the kind of guerrilla tactic of kind of, by not having a space, of operating in other people's spaces. And sometimes when you don't have a fixed venue in which to operate, it can allow you to keep being creative and to keep thinking. And it's something that Patricia Cisneros talked about recently in New York at the Frick Collection. It was a conference about collecting Latin American art in the US. And she was praising, or not praising, but she was celebrating the fact that they've never had a space themselves. And so it's forced them to get out and to share their collection. And I think we have been in the phase of thinking about the space and really desiring that for many years, but actually in thinking about not having that, although we might have a smaller, bigger space, it allows us to kind of start thinking about getting out there a bit more. So it could be an advantage.
I wasn't suggesting a wholesale takeover, but I was suggesting that perhaps they give you the space at least for, say, a 2-month period once a year, and incorporate it, like occasionally step aside and let you have a program there with the entire space. Because I think it's something that could become very notable.
I think it's incredibly valuable to have voices speaking up, as it were, for Escala or whatever, in that particular case for Escala, outside, from people like yourself, because we really need to keep the profile raised. And I was very shocked, actually, to see the other day an article about art in Latin American art in the UK, which didn't mention Escala. I won't say any more about who wrote it, but it was a great surprise to me. And so, just a sort of an example of the way you actually have to keep alert and keep waving the banners, really.
Sounds like you're from militancy.
Hello. I suppose you're dealing with two different subject matters in being militant. If one is bringing awareness of about art from a particular region, and another one is a gender issue. And in that situation, do you think the approaches need to be different? Because I see gender as being quite a systemic thing within cultures, and perhaps the issue around art from a region is more about raising awareness. I don't know if you agree or what comments you have on that.
I think you're right. Oh, sorry, you go.
You think she is right? Or
I think potentially you're right, because I think that you can't, sorry, this is rather stupid, you can't deny the fact that you're a woman, but you could actually not wish to be identified with Latin America as an artist. That's just one comment.
well, but some women do not want to be identified as women artists. They just want to be artists. So I actually think the problems are very similar. It's all about raising awareness as the method to addressing any inequalities, imbalances.
I think it also depends on context, because in the US it's much easier to be a collection of art from Latin America than it is in the UK, because of the obvious geographical proximity of the US to Mexico in particular, but then the rest of Latin America, and historical ties. We have those, but we don't often talk about them in the UK. So it's also a question of bringing that out as in different ways as far as we can. So I think it's also a question of context. It's harder for us here than it would be somewhere else.
Are there any more? Laura.
I see under the Latin American market or in the Latin American representations, there's a lack, or even it's evolving, about research, publications, academics. About when I see what's they are providing papers or PhD or master thesis on Latin American art, how many artist women are studied in the research field?
How many women?
No, the writers. How many people are writing, studying about Latin American women? Or in general, we can see about women artists. It's still, you see a lot of books, research, magazines that are represented mostly men or maybe non-Latin Americans. Then how is expanding maybe the research on women or Latin American women?
I've seen a statistic someplace that 90% of books on artists are about male artists.
Okay.
But I'm even surprised that it would be 10%. So I think that might even be mentions in books, because I haven't seen 10% of books on women artists. But it's a growing thing, and I don't know if you've noticed in the past couple of months, BBC in particular has had a great series of shows, one looking at women in pop art, where it proved that women were very active in the emergence of pop art and were forgotten in the second wave. And then Amanda Vickery's History of Women in Art. And at the same time, Annie Kevins has had a show recently at the Contemporary Art Society, I think it's called, I've forgotten. And funnily enough, she based her paintings mostly on Nimwa's book. But it's a hot topic, and people are really actively considering it. Where are the women in art? When Tate did their rehang at Tate Britain, they actively looked in their archives to try and bring out some of the women artists who had been forgotten. So there is a movement this way, but there's a long way to go.
There's a long way to go, and I think it's there are certain women artists from Latin America who have, as it were, moved into a next sort of sphere of the international. And so they are artists, and there are not very many, a handful, who are studied in art history departments where there isn't a specialist Latin American field. So there is, somebody wants to work on women artists, and they will have heard of Frida Kahlo, they might have heard of Lydia Clark, they've possibly heard of Mira Schendel, but there aren't that many others. And so there are so many women artists in Latin America that one needs, as it were, to need to open it up a bit. No one seems to work on Maria Izquierdo, for example. So there's a lot of research that needs to be done, a lot of names that need to be kind of raised into our consciousness.
I would just like to add that I think that actually it's looking very promising for studies of Latin American female artists. There have been quite a few exhibitions recently. There was the retrospective Ana Mendieta at South Bank, also the Liliana Porta in the Malva in Buenos Aires. And from my perspective as a student at Cambridge University, the Latin American department, on the syllabus, I think there were exclusively female artists, actually. We looked at Doris Salcedo, Ana Mendieta, Cecilia Vicuña. In fact, I don't know whether that's related to perhaps the academics who are involved in the department, maybe being slightly biased towards the female perspective, but I don't think there was, the emphasis was certainly not on male artists from Latin America, but rather on the women, and contemporary as well.
Yes, I would like to say I'm a photographer from Latin America. I won't start defending men here, of course. But in photography in Latin America, women are very importantly present. This situation is not exactly Mexico. The number one disciple of Don Manuel Álvarez Bravo is certainly a woman, and Graciela is the most influential photographer in Mexico, although there are many men as well, but it's not only Graciela, there is many others, Jan Polsky, many other women, Lola Álvarez Bravo, in the case of Chile, Paz Errázuriz is probably one of the most important photographers from Chile, and in Brazil we just had the major art piece of the Latin American photo book, Amazonia, was made by Claudia Andujar, who is now extremely recognized and will have a new pavilion at Inhotim in Minas Gerais, in Argentina, Anne-Marie Henrich, Greta Stern, Sara Facio, Adriana Lestido. Women in photography are, I wouldn't say equal, because certainly in the press side, where many photographers come from, it's certainly a male activity, because you need to push a lot to be there, and it's masculine in the news where you are there. I don't know why, but in the art scene, in photography in Latin America, women have a very important role. I don't see this difference so important.
I think. Sorry. I take your point. I still think. I think that there are, I mean, large historical changes that happen and that have facilitated women photographers, women artists in their careers.